Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday night or Sunday late evening, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Shendor in the Bronx, Lorraine in Texas, Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in Missouri, Sharon in New Jersey, Leona Sue in Southern Illinois, Karen in Northern California, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Mickey in New Jersey, Ella, Debbie in New Jersey, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Another short daf, another short page for us. Our page is page 85 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 5, today continuing our discussion of Mishna number 8 in this chapter. We're generally talking about when a buyer and a seller have made a deal, and it turns out that what they negotiated for, what they thought they were purchasing or what they thought they were selling, turns out not to be so. A mistake was made. Either the value was a mistake. Somebody thought he was selling something good and he was selling something bad, or he claimed he was selling good and he was selling something bad, or he thought he was selling something cheap and it turned out he was selling something good, and so the buyer was going to get too good a deal. And so if the difference is large enough, or if it's a completely mistaken transaction, they thought they made a deal to sell white wheat, a certain species of wheat, and it turned out to be reddish wheat, which is a different species of wheat. So then either one of them could renege on the sale. Now, pertinent to that discussion, we are treating once again with the kinyan, the formal act of acquisition that shows that the transaction has actually been completed. So for people who might be new, in ancient times, if you're buying and selling either movable property or property that can be used as a guarantee, which is to say land, so just because the money has changed hands, that the purchaser has given the money, does not mean that the sale has actually been finalized. And this was actually a protection that the sages instituted for buyers. And so the buyer doesn't actually receive the property until there's some formal act of acquisition. Sometimes that means he lifts the property if it's a small item. Sometimes it means he pulls the property. If he's buying a donkey or a goat or a cow and he pulls the reins, he makes the animal move. So witnesses could see that and say, okay, the buyer took possession of the property. Sometimes the transfer of a bill of sale will affect acquisition. Sometimes it won't. There's a lot of nuances to this whole area of the law, and we're continuing our discussion of it. We picked this up at the very bottom of page 84b, where we left off yesterday. So the Gemara continues to discuss the manner in which an acquisition takes place. Rav and Shmuel both say, and now we're on 85a, a person's vessels effect acquisition of any item placed inside them for him in any place in which they are situated except for the public domain. Meaning if the seller places movable property in a vessel, like a basket or a bag or a wagon, could be, that vessel that belongs to the buyer is going to effect this acquisition for him. Now, what's very important about a kinyan is that prior to the kinyan, the property, if something goes wrong, there's a fire, there's a lightning strike, something unexpected happens, the seller hasn't delivered the property. So even if you receive the money, since the buyer hasn't made the kinyan, the formal act of acquisition, if the property is destroyed, so the seller bears the responsibility, the liability for that, and he's going to have to either give the money back or replace the property. By contrast, after the kinyan, now the buyer has acquired the property. It's his property. The deal is done. Now if lightning strikes the produce, so it's going to be the loss of the buyer. Now, that seems pretty obvious when the property is handed over from the seller to the buyer, but in a situation where they effect the acquisition and it's finalized, but the buyer leaves the property in the possession on the premises, let's say, of the seller, and it's destroyed there, so you might have thought that the seller still bears the responsibility because he's agreed to hold on to it for a few days. But now he's actually performing a different function. He is a custodian of the property, and different rules will apply as to how much responsibility he has in that situation. So now, just to get more specific, we're saying that a person's vessel, right, his container, can acquire property for him, can acquire the subject of a transaction for him in any place, meaning in the buyer's property or in the seller's property or on private property belonging to someone else, but apparently not in the public domain. So the fact that the seller deposited in the vessel of the buyer might not be enough for the buyer to acquire it, because perhaps the buyer doesn't even know that it's been deposited in his vessel, and that might be a good reason why we would, just from a common sense point of view, the equity of the situation would seem to us like it's good that he hasn't acquired, even though it's in his vessel. Let's continue. So I said, the person's vessels affect acquisition of any item placed inside of them, and this is in any place in which those vessels are situated, except for the public domain. And now a differing opinion, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish both say, even in the public domain, one's vessels affect acquisition of items placed in them. So Rav Papa explains, these Amoraim, these sages of the Gemara period, later sages. I'm being a little bit extra explanatory today because I put out a video earlier today, What is the Talmud? Shared it on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and X. And so there may be some people tuning in for the first time in our class, checking out, listening a little bit to what a Talmud class is like. And if you're here and that's you, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Okay, so Rav Papa says that these Amoraim, so these are sages of the Gemara period. That means that sages who were debating and discussing and arguing and ruling on these laws in the period between the year 200 of the Common Era to about 500 of the Common Era. Tanaim are the sages from the earlier period who were instrumental in finalizing the rulings that are contained in the Mishna, which was set down, redacted around the year 200. Okay, so Rav Papa said, these Amoraim do not disagree. Here, when Rav and Shmuel state that one's vessel does not effect acquisition for him, they are speaking of a vessel placed in the public domain. And there, when Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish state that his vessel does effect acquisition on his behalf, they are referring to a vessel located in an alleyway, which is private property. An alleyway in the Talmud means a private street into which private courtyards open up. So it's jointly owned by the people who live in those courtyards. Their houses on those courtyards, and the courtyards open into this alleyway. So it is private property. And why do they call an alleyway the public domain for purposes of this law? The reason is that an alleyway is not a private domain in the sense that multiple, for sure, private domains open into it, but the public also has access to that alleyway. Now, so it's sort of pseudo-public. Now, the Gemara points out, so too it is reasonable to interpret Rabbi Yochanan's statement in this manner. As Rabbi Abahu says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, a person's vessels effect acquisition for him in any place where he has permission to keep them. And it can be inferred from here, in a location where he has permission to keep them, yes, his vessels effect acquisition for him. But in a place where he does not have permission to keep his vessels, because he has no stake of ownership in that property, so they do not effect acquisition for him, and one has permission to keep his vessels in an alleyway, but not in the public domain. Yes, anyone can use the public domain, but you don't have a specific permission to leave your vessels there, and if you do, somebody could easily pick them up and take them away. Now, the Gemara conclude from this statement that when Rabbi Yochanan referred to the public domain in this situation, he meant an alleyway. Now, the Gemara suggests coming here a difficulty in this interpretation from a baraisa. So a baraisa is a quite authoritative ruling from the sages of the period of the Mishnah, but not as authoritative as a Mishnah. And when we say the Mishnah, we mean the whole collection of Mishnayos or of individual Mishnahs. So that's why we'll use that word collectively to mean all Mishnahs or specifically about a single Mishnah. So a Baraisa is going to be not as authoritative as a Mishnah because it was not included in the collection of Mishnayos. But it still does have a lot of authority because it's from that same period and spoken by the same sages. And so the sages of the Gemara will often look to Baraisas to help sharpen their understanding of a particular Mishnah. So the Gemara suggests, come in here a difficulty from a Baraisa. So there are 4 cases with regard to sellers, i.e. 4 methods through which merchandise is acquired. When the seller measures merchandise for the buyer, right? So the seller is measuring out some merchandise. Let's say somebody is buying pounds of wheat, right? So how many pounds is he getting? He says, I'd like 3 pounds of wheat. Okay, so now the seller is measuring out 3 pounds of wheat. So when the seller measures merchandise for the buyer, before the measuring vessel has been filled, the merchandise in the vessel still belongs to the seller, and the seller can change his mind and cancel the sale. But once the measuring vessel has been filled, the merchandise belongs to the buyer. In what case is this statement said? It is said when the seller measures with a measuring vessel that does not belong to either of them. But if the measuring vessel belonged to one of them, the buyer acquires the items of sale one by one as they are placed in the measuring vessel. Now, in what case is this statement said? It is said when the seller measures the items in the public domain or in a courtyard that does not belong to either of them. But if it happens in the domain of the seller, the buyer does not acquire the merchandise until he lifts the measuring vessel or until he moves it out of the domain of the seller. If it is in the domain of the buyer, once the seller accepts upon himself to sell, the buyer acquires it. If the merchandise is located in the domain of this individual with whom it has been deposited, the buyer does not acquire it until the bailee accepts upon himself to designate a place where the merchandise is to be stored for the buyer, or until the buyer rents from the bailee the place where the merchandise is situated. Now, these laws are quite complex. And you might be sitting there thinking, so somebody goes to the store to buy some wheat and he's got to keep in mind, like, when do I acquire? When do I not acquire? When is it fully mine? When do I have to be concerned that it isn't really mine? Or if I lost it, that I lost it, or that he lost it? But really what we're talking about is exceptional cases where problems happen and the buyer and seller end up litigating the case. They go to their rabbi or they go to a rabbinic court to figure out what happened. Of course, in the normal course of things, they were just normal customs, and people would go to the market, or they would go to a store, or they would go to a stand where somebody was selling and they wanted to buy. And, 99 out of 100 transactions just transpired according to the customs of the time, and everything was fine. But when something went wrong, when there was the unexpected destruction of property, and they're arguing about who bears liability, okay, so then the rabbis will run it through this analysis so that people understand how does this square with Torah law. And as has been the case throughout this tractate, and particularly these last few chapters, if the buyer and seller would make very clear what it is that they're trying to transact. This is how much I'm buying. This is how much I'm paying for it. This is when I expect to take possession of it. There wouldn't be a problem. But so often people buy and sell, with just a few words spoken, and then it's unclear how much property was delivered and when it was delivered. So let's continue. So in any event, the Baraisa teaches with regard to a transaction in the public domain, or in a courtyard that does not belong to either of them, that if the measuring vessel belonged to one of them, the buyer acquires the items of sale one by one as they are placed in the measuring vessel. Now we're on page 85b. Every page has an A side and a B side. So what? Is it not stating that a buyer's vessels effect acquisition of items on his behalf, even in the actual public domain, as opposed to the alleyway that we're saying is like a public domain for the purpose of these laws? And this would contradict Rav Papa's explanation. So the Gemara answers, no, the Baraisa is referring to an alleyway, not the actual public domain. And the Gemara asks, how can this be what the Baraisa means? But the Baraisa teaches that it is similar to a courtyard that does not belong to either of them, i.e. a location to which neither of them have any rights, whereas they both have some rights in an alleyway that they both live on. So consequently, this must be referring to the actual public domain and not an alleyway. And the Gemara answers, what is the meaning of the phrase, a courtyard that does not belong to either of them? It also refers to shared property, specifically a courtyard shared by partners, which does not belong to this one entirely and does not belong to that one entirely, but rather it is the property of both of them. And consequently, this courtyard is comparable to an alleyway. Right, and if you deposit property for someone, if you deposit the object of a sale in his courtyard in a place that's protected, then you have given it into his possession. Does that acquire for him? Depends on the situation. Let's keep reading. So Rav Sheshes raises a dilemma before Rav Huna. If the vessels of the buyer are in the domain of the seller. Now that's a very common occurrence. You walk into a store and you're carrying a shopping bag. You put your shopping bag on the counter and the guy behind the counter is going to measure out some produce of whatever he sells. And let's say he sells tea and he's going to weigh out some tea leaves and then he deposits them in your bag. Or he puts them on the counter and you put them in your bag. So that's a case where you've got a vessel, your vessel, while you're situated in the domain of the seller. So let's see what happens then. So if the vessels of the buyer are in the domain of the seller, does the buyer acquire the merchandise once it is placed in his vessels or not? So Rav Huna said to him, you learned the answer already in a Mishna in Tractate Gittin, page Page 77a. A wife is divorced when her husband hands her a bill of divorce or places it in a manner that is considered equivalent to handing it to her. For example, placing it in her courtyard. So under Jewish law, when is a couple divorced? When he hands her the gett, right? So the gett is the bill of divorce, and when he gives it to her, and it's a properly written gett, and it's witnessed, etc. So when he hands it to her, at that moment, they are divorced. Sometimes the couple is really, they can't be in the same room together. So he might send the gett via an agent. She might receive the gett via an agent. And another way that he can give her the gett is, with witnesses looking, he places it in property that belongs solely to her, which is not always so simple to accomplish in a very patriarchal system, where if the wife had property that she brought into the marriage, okay, she might have her own property, but otherwise it might not be so easy to find property that belongs solely to her. So now, why are we talking about divorce? Because we're talking about that her courtyard can acquire the gett for her, and therefore they become divorced. So are we going to say by analogy that a buyer standing in a seller's store, when the produce is deposited in his bag, he has acquired it, even though he's standing on the property of the seller? So accordingly, if the husband threw the bill of divorce to her, into her lap, or into her basket, this woman is divorced, even if she was standing in her husband's domain at the time, because her courtyard is likened to her lap or her basket. By the same token, even if the buyer's vessels are in the domain of the seller, they effect acquisition of the sold items on his behalf. Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna, what is the reason that you resolved Rav Shesh's dilemma from that Mishnah, which has already been struck with 100 strikes of a hammer? In their analysis of this Mishnah, and Rav Steinsaltz explains what is this 100 strikes of a hammer, means that in their analysis of this Mishnah, the sages have already inserted so many qualifications that it cannot be understood in a straightforward manner. So much the same way that we could take a verse from the written Torah, right, something that's, seems straightforward, like you shall observe the Sabbath day, or you shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And it's like, how do you do that? There's so many laws that pertain to how we keep Shabbos, right? What work we don't do, remember the Sabbath day means that you light candles, that you make kiddush, you make positive commandments, that you shall guard or observe the Sabbath day. Those are all the things that you don't do, all the 39 categories of labor that you don't do. And you wouldn't know all these things from the simple laws that are written in the Torah, and there's a little bit more elaboration. You shall not kindle lights on Sabbath, etc. But 1/100th or 1/500th of the laws of Shabbat are written explicitly in the Torah. The rest were either given to Moses at Mount Sinai or inferred and interpreted by the sages out of the laws that are in the Torah. Likewise, when the sages made a ruling about a matter of commercial law, it might turn out that their ruling was a little bit too simple, a little too limiting, not covering enough situations in the real world. And so a simple ruling in the Mishnah might end up being elaborated and interpreted in the Gemara with many, many more. This is what we can do, this is what we can't do from the Gemara. And that's what they're saying here. That in terms of handing a woman a gett, there's all kinds of nuances. You can't say any kind of simple ruling like, okay, he put it in her lap, or okay, he put it in her basket, or okay, he put it in her courtyard. There's a lot of, well, where's the courtyard? Is it guarded? Where was she? Was she aware when it was put in her lap? Was it with her will, against her will? Many nuances. As Rabbi Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, this law of the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin about when she's received the gett applies only if her basket was hanging from her body so that it is considered on her or in her hand. right? Just because her basket is sitting in front of her, even though it's her basket, but it's in the domain of her husband, it doesn't acquire the gett for her. It has to be situated in such a way, like hanging on her body, attached to her, that it is considered like an extension of her hand. And Reish Lakish says it is sufficient if it was tied to her, even though it is not hanging from her, but resting on the ground. And Rav Ada bar Ahava says the Mishnah is referring to a case where her basket was placed between her thighs. Although it is not hanging from her, since it is placed on her body, it serves to acquire the bill of divorce on her behalf. She's got full control of that basket, so it can acquire for her, even though it's not tied to her. Rav Misharshia, the son of Rabbi Ami, says this is referring to a case where her husband was a basket seller. Huh? What does that have to do with it? Since he is not particular about the place where the basket into which he placed the bill of divorce is located, as his entire courtyard is filled with baskets, it is considered as though he expressly granted her the right to make use of its location. In other words, that he rented to her this particular location among his many baskets for her to place her basket, and now her basket is not in his domain. It's like he carved out a piece of his domain for her, and that's why he can receive on her behalf. Rabbi Yochanan says the place of her lap, i.e. the place within her husband's property where she's standing or sitting, that place belongs to her. And the place of her basket is acquired to her, meaning it can acquire for her. Rava said, what is the reason behind this statement of Rabbi Yochanan? It is because a person, including a husband, is not particular, neither about the place of her lap nor about the place of her basket, as she requires these areas and do not take up much space. It is evident from all these qualifications that one cannot infer a halakhic, which is to say a legal principle, from here with regard to a buyer's vessels in a seller's domain. In other words, even though a woman's basket can acquire for her a gett so that she becomes divorced at that moment, the nuances of when a woman has received a gett from her husband are so many and so, distinct and multiplied. The laws have become so multiplied that we're not going to be able to learn out from the case of her basket acquiring a gett whether a buyer's basket has acquired produce in the laws of transactions. And that's good. We don't want these two areas of law to lean on each other too much, because buying and selling, okay, so if we make a mistake, if there's a mistaken ruling, if there's an uncertainty, okay, so, and then later we figured out that something was done wrong, so the money can change hands again. It's reversible, it's fixable, there's not any permanent damage done for the most part. But if we get a matter of Jewish law wrong in the area of divorce, it could create a catastrophe. Because if a husband and wife believe that they're divorced and she's now free to marry again, and she marries another guy and she has a child with the second husband, and then it turned out that the first divorce was not valid because something went wrong in the procedure of achieving that divorce, and therefore she's still married to the first husband, then the second marriage was not a marriage, and a child that she had with that man, with the second husband that she thought was her husband, was actually an adulterous affair, and the child that is the offspring of that union is a mamzer, which is a terrible situation for the child who's innocent, but now is prohibited from marrying almost all other Jews, except for another mamzer or a ger, a convert. But the child of the union of a mamzer and a convert is still a mamzer and won't be able to marry other Jews. What is the remedy of a mamzer? It's funny, we just had a whole class in that this morning from Rabbi Meni in our show. We're not going to get into it now. It's really complicated. But in the old times, when there was slavery, he could marry a slave. And the child of that union would actually then could do a conversion and become a full-fledged Jew who could marry other Jews. But one thing that was said in part of along with that discussion today that was so interesting is I've told you many times that slavery was just everywhere in the ancient world. And when the Torah was given into the world, it severely limited the rights of a slave owner. The slave owner did not have the right to do whatever he wanted with his slave, to kill his slave if he wanted. The Torah came along and said, no, you have the owner has obligations toward the slave. His power is absolutely limited. And basically what the Torah introduced into the world was a kind of gradient by which slavery has been named as something not good. And while it was not going to be eliminated immediately, it began a process. And it took a long time, but thank God, the presence of slavery in the world became less and less and less frequent, and eventually was made illegal basically everywhere in the world. Tragically, there is still slavery in the world, but it is illegal. And may we soon see a day when all slavery and human trafficking is ended. Okay, enough about that digression. Okay, so where we were talking about, let's just say this again. Right, so in other words, so we learned that you cannot infer laws about whether somebody's basket acquires merchandise for him in a store from the laws of whether a woman's basket acquires the gett, the bill of divorce, for her in the laws of marriage. Now, the Gemara asks, but from the fact that the first clause is referring to the vessels of the seller as currently understood, the latter clause must also be referring to the vessels of the seller. So say the latter clause, if the merchandise was in the domain of the buyer. So if, for example, the seller standing in his store, he's providing the shopping bag, right? And he's weighing out the merchandise into a shopping bag that at this point still belongs to the seller. So even though he has said, well, this is how much I'm selling to you, and here now I've weighed it out, and it's in your bag that I'm going to give to you, but it's not your bag yet, right? So has the sale been finalized? Presumably no, not until the buyer picks up that bag and walks out of the store. But let's see, right? So rather resolve the dilemma from that which was taught in a Baraisa. If the merchandise was in the domain of the seller, the buyer does not acquire the merchandise until he lifts it or until he removes it from the domain of the seller. And what? Is it not referring to merchandise placed in the vessels of the buyer, which proves that the buyer's vessels do not affect acquisition of the merchandise on his behalf when they're in the seller's domain? And the Gemara answers, no, this does not serve as a proof, as it is referring to merchandise that is in the vessels of the seller. And that is why the buyer must lift or pull the merchandise to acquire it. If it was his own vessels, he would have already acquired it when it was placed in them. The Gemara asks, but from the fact that the first clause is referring to the vessels of the seller, as currently understood in our analysis, the latter clause of our Mishnah must also be referring to the vessels of the seller. Say the latter clause, which said, if the merchandise was in the domain of the buyer, once the seller accepts upon himself to sell an item, the buyer acquires it. And if this is referring to merchandise in the vessels of the seller, as in the earlier clause, why does the buyer acquire it at that moment? The Gemara answers, in the latter clause, we come to a different scenario, which involves the buyer's vessels, not the seller's vessels. So the Gemara asks, but if the clauses of the Baraisa are addressing different cases, why was it stated without qualification? Why didn't the Mishnah say we're talking about different cases? And the Gemara answers, the normal way of things is that in the house of the seller, the vessels of the seller are commonly found. And in the house of the buyer, the vessels of the buyer are commonly found. So in sum, the dilemma cannot be resolved from that Baraisa. So we don't know yet what our Mishnah was saying. So Rava said, come in here a resolution from a different Baraisa. If one pulled his donkey drivers, thereby dragging along with them the donkeys laden with goods, and likewise, if he pulled his laborers who were carrying merchandise that he wished to purchase, and he brought them into his house, whether he fixed a price before he measured the merchandise or whether he measured before fixing a price, both parties can renege on the sale, provided that the merchandise has not been unloaded from the laborers or the donkeys. So just because, so there's a buyer and a seller, and it's a big deal, right? So the seller comes and he says, okay, I got 4 donkey loads of wheat. You want to buy it? And the guy says, yeah, I'm going to buy it. They're talking about the price. It starts raining. The buyer says, you know what, let's get out of the rain. And he leads, the first donkey driver or the first donkey, into his courtyard under his roof. And then maybe they negotiate about the price. And the seller says, okay, we agreed on the price. And you've already brought the stuff into your courtyard. Deal's done. Right? And only then the buyer hears the information that the seller just got whispered to him by his assistant that the price of this merchandise has dropped on the open market because a ship just arrived with tons of it and the price just fell. And the buyer wants to say, no, I don't want this deal. Forget about it. I'm out. I do not agree to this deal. Can he get out of it? Apparently, yes, because the fact that he pulled the donkeys into his courtyard and they agreed on a price, and even if the money has changed hands, the acquisition has not been done until the buyer starts to unload these donkeys. That's according to this Baraisa. So let's read it again. Rava said, come and hear a resolution from a Baraisa. If one pulled his donkey drivers, thereby dragging along with them the donkeys laden with goods, and likewise if he pulled his laborers who were carrying merchandise that he wished to purchase, and he brought them into his house, so whether he fixed a price before he measured the merchandise or whether he measured before fixing a price, both parties can renege on the sale, provided that the merchandise has not been unloaded from the laborers or the donkeys. We're going to start a little bit on tomorrow's page. We're at the top of 86a. But in the case where he unloaded the merchandise from them and brought it into his house, if he fixed a price before he measured the merchandise, both parties are no longer able to renege on the sale. If he measured the merchandise before fixing a price, both of them are still able to renege on the sale because there was no fixed price. The Gemara comments, and from the fact that the vessels of the seller, when in the domain of the buyer, do not affect acquisition of the merchandise for the seller, i.e. they do not prevent the buyer from acquiring the merchandise, so one can derive that the vessels of the buyer, if they're in the domain of the seller, do not affect acquisition of the merchandise on his behalf as well. So it's further evidence that simply getting the merchandise into his own basket while he's standing in the seller's store does not complete the acquisition. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said the merchandise was not placed in the domain of the buyer in vessels belonging to the seller. Rather, this barais is referring to a case where he emptied the vessels onto the ground. And conversely, if the merchandise remains in the seller's vessels, the buyer does not acquire it. Rava became angry with Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak at his rejection of Rava's proof and retorted, does the Baraisa teach he emptied them? No, it teaches he unloaded them, i.e. he kept the goods in vessels belonging to the seller. So rather, Mar Bar Rav Ashi says this proof can be rejected by means of a different interpretation, and the law of the Baraisa does not refer to vessels full of goods, but it is stated with regard to bundles of garlic that were tied together. Therefore, they are unloaded straight onto the floor in the buyer's domain. Now, with regard to the matter itself, Huna, the son of Marzutra, said to Ravina, since the Baraisa teaches he unloaded them, which indicates that unloading the merchandise constitutes the act of acquisition, what difference is there to me if he fixed a price, and what difference is there to me if he did not fix a price? And Ravina said to him, if he fixed a price, he has made up his mind to sell, and therefore the transaction has taken place. But if he did not fix a price, he has not made up his mind to sell, and the transaction does not occur. How could there be a transaction if we haven't set a price? In any event, no convincing proof has been found with regard to the law in a case where the vessels of the buyer are sitting or situated in the domain of the seller. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, Ravina and Rav Ashi are, I'm going to keep going. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a resolution. As Rav and Shmuel both say, a person's vessel effects acquisition for him of any item placed inside it in any place that it is situated. Full stop. What is added by the phrase, in any place? Does it not serve to add the domain of the seller when you're standing in the seller's store? And Rav Ashi answered, there it is referring to a specific case where the seller said to him, go, acquire it. In that situation, the buyer does acquire the merchandise. This does not refer to a standard case where the buyer's vessels are located in the domain of the seller and the seller weighed it out into the vessels, and we're not sure yet whether the transaction has been completed just because the seller weighed it out into the bag or basket or other vessel of the buyer. And that's where we're going to leave off for today. Let's take a couple of questions. Bell, I really appreciate the intro explanations, although I have been with the classes for quite a while. I also read the Jacob Neusner book, Introduction to the Talmud. So very good, thank you. And Jason Mills, which I think is a new name. Welcome, Jason. This feels overwhelming, for sure. So when I first started learning this, I just dove in and I was lost for so long. But if you stay with it, it starts to make sense, right? It definitely starts to make sense the more you stay with it and understand, because you're landing right here in the middle of a discussion that we've been having for weeks, and that will continue for weeks. But when you stay with it, you start to acquire the sort of mode of interpretation and argumentation of the sages, and it starts to repeat, and you start to see, okay, I've seen that before, I understood that before, and you get better at it. And sometimes even when you've been doing it for 20 years, you fall into a difficult passage, and it feels overwhelming no matter who is learning and how long they've been at it. Jason, with regard to a wife receiving the bill of divorce, what happens if the basket was stolen? Now, what really matters there, what you're saying is she doesn't know, right? What if it was deposited in her property or into her basket, she wasn't aware that it was deposited, and then it was taken away? And that's why when you're giving her a gett, it has to be witnessed, right? It has to be witnessed. It's not just a matter of giving it to her, and she might have missed it, not realized it happened, and she doesn't know she's divorced, and she continues to act as if she is not divorced, right? When she in fact is, and certainly that could lead to problems. Even worse is when she thinks she's divorced and it turns out that she's not, right? But in both cases, that's why the presence of witnesses was so important in the ancient world, where they had much less of a paper trail involved in all kinds of transactions, contracts, marriage contracts, divorce contracts, purchase and sale of property, etc. There was much less paper involved, and that's why witnesses were so important for every matter. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.